Now we will turn to our commentator, Professor Derek Penslar, who from 2018 will be the William Lee Frost Professor of Modern Jewish History at Harvard University. Professor Penslar was previously Samuel Sachs Professor of Jewish History at the University of Toronto. His interests span modern Jewish history from a transnational and global perspective. He's interested in modern Israel, diasporas of Jewish societies, European colonialism, post-colonial states, and global nationalist movements, all of which make him an ideal commentator on these four wonderful papers. Professor Penslar.
I want to thank all four speakers for really marvelous presentations. The work is very well developed considering that we're at December 1st. So you all have lots of time to move further, but you've already made really tremendous progress. First, about Emma's paper about suffrage, suffragists versus suffragettes. The thing that went through my mind as I was reading your short presentation, and even more as I was listening just now, is the relationship between your topic and the general phenomenon of the social novel in 19th century Victorian culture. That is, 19th century culture in Britain was dominated by notions of questions. There was the question of poverty. It was called the social question. There was the fate of Ireland, the Irish question, and then the issue about women's voting rights. It was called the women's question. In the United States, there was something similar about temperance. The international, it was the alcohol question. The issue of, it was always a question. And it's a kind of rhetorical trope that suggests that there's some sort of social issue that elites have actually helped, a problem they've helped create, but they're somehow going to project the problem onto somebody else. So the problem is the poor, the problem is women, the problem is alcohol. The problem is somehow somebody else's responsibility. But it generates a vast literature of imaginative fictions, the social novel. Which was certainly depicted quite a bit I mean, going back to North and South, and the sort of literature analyzed by Gertrude Himmelfarb in her 2 volumes on the relationship between poverty, compassion, and literature in Victorian Britain. So this makes me think about plays and the relationship between the play and the novel. What are the specific didactic and dramatic functions of the theater as opposed to the novel? Were the tactics of the WSPU inherently performative, theatrical? So is there some relationship between the theatricality of what these people do for a living and the theatricality of breaking shop windows or whatever is happening on the streets of London? And I'm particularly interested in Elizabeth Robbins, who writes a play and a novel. And exactly what is the function of the one versus the other? Because I'm thinking of someone I'm writing a book about. I'm writing a book about a Viennese, Budapest-born, Viennese-raised journalist named Theodor Herzl, who became a founder of the Zionist movement, and who wrote plays and had great dreams of writing what he called a political novel. A colleague of his said, you should write a novel about the Jews like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Again, a social novel. And Herzl dreams of writing this novel, but instead he writes a social play. Only towards the end of his life does he actually produce the novel. And the novel that he produces towards the end of his life and the play have very different political and social valences, although they're both didactic works. So I would like to hear very much about this relationship between the play and the novel, between theatricality and the fictivity of literature, which is grounded in the women's question, which is really, I think, an outgrowth of the social question. Okay. Now to the Balkans and to the Ottoman Empire. It's marvelous, marvelous work. One thought that goes through my head, maybe it's because although my intellectual wanderings all over the world have taken me far from when I first began as a German historian when I was your age, I still think that so much of what we call Orientalism is actually an internal European dialogue about the way Europeans perceive each other. You think of Maria Todorova's work on imagining the Balkans, or Larry Wolf's work on imagining Galicia, that this Orientalization occurs within Europe itself. The notion of the backward Eastern or Southern realm. Now, in your narrative, you talk about the Ottoman development of railroads going back to the 1830s, although admitting they're financed by foreign enterprises. Nonetheless, the concession regime, as you explain it, was not only a global phenomenon, but one that was quite profitable for the Ottoman government. But as I was listening just now, it occurred to me, there has been a good deal of work recently on the transformation of tax farming in the late Ottoman Empire, and that what you're talking about really is a very sophisticated and lucrative form of tax farming, because the Ottoman regime is much later than most European states, say, in the development of a centralized revenue administration. This isn't a sign of primitiveness. It's a sign of it's simply a different way of raising money. I mean, the French are already moving from tax farming to central taxation during the revolutionary Napoleonic periods. So I think this is part of a bigger picture. Similarly, when you talk about the hiring of Ottoman subjects in railroad construction and maintenance, this makes me think of the work of Dan Stoltz, who has recently worked on the scientific exploration in 19th century Egypt, particularly the development of astronomical observatories and how many Egyptians were employed as technicians. And there's this constant, movement between Europe and Egypt of technicians and of experts in astronomical science. And then, last but not least on your topic, you talk about vernacular railroad organization, linking the Ottoman Empire with the Balkans. It's all excellent. But then what's left is, if we can sort of go back, what then is the role of the Central European entrepreneur? I'm thinking particularly of Moritz Hirsch, Türken Hirsch, as he was known, for his role in the development of railways in the Ottoman Empire. And then, given this much more robust relationship you're describing between a vigorous Ottoman Empire, no longer the sick man of Europe, doing quite well, what is the relationship between this robust regime and these entrepreneurs? Is there tension then? Is there real tension between the entrepreneurs who are trying to maximize their own profits and the Ottoman Empire, which clearly is pursuing its own interests? And now, for India's paper, and to go back to the social question about the Aya, is a marvelous project. How do we contextualize the Aya against the general background of domestic service, which is this, probably the single largest source of employment in certainly later Victorian. I don't know if, frankly, I don't have the statistics in front of me. Are there more people on the land working in agriculture or working in domestic service? I'm not sure. There might be an expert here who knows. But there are an awful lot of people in domestic service in Victorian and Edwardian Britain. And when you describe the Aya, I'm thinking, yes, of course, there is the added value is probably not the right term, but there is the distinct notion of this foreign woman who has come to the United Kingdom, but the individual being defined through their livelihood. The maid, the butler, the footman. This is so much a staple of British culture, middle class and upper class culture regarding the dependence on domestic service, that the domestic servant is essential, cherished, and yet derided and upbraided. So again, where are we talking about this general phenomenon of the domestic servant, and what is the specificity of the Aya? Also, are there Ayas from other parts of empire? Or is this really Indian? That is, the British Empire is vast. I wonder, there are no Ayas from British East Africa or something. This is something specific to or I'm asking if it's specific to the British relationship with India. And again, as part of the social question, the Aya's home was in South Hackney. That's where my grandmother was born. My grandmother was a Lithuanian, her parents were Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who came to Hackney, which had a large population of very poor Jews, and then her entire family were killed in a house fire, actually. And she wound up growing up in an orphanage in Hackney. And it was a very poor area. And again, so to tie the Aya in with this larger question of immigration, of other immigrant groups, of poverty, and of concern for the social issue, which raises, last but not least, the question of sexual danger. The Aya, after all, is a female servant. It raises questions about liaisons with employers, pregnancies, and a whole kind of possible, at least, set of relationships characteristic of discussions of the Irish maid, which was very much part of the culture of the time that you're talking about. Last but not least, to Cyprus, which then makes me think of a very different set of examples, not related to Europe, but actually related to the Middle East, where I also fish from time to time. I just want to make clear that I understand when you talk about national sovereignty, you mean Greek sovereignty? You mean, when we say national sovereignty, means enosis. It means unification. Okay, so a kind of, I think of Klein Deutschland and Gross Deutschland, this notion of Austria yearning to be unified with the German Empire back in the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th centuries. And then when you mention a pragmatic streak and a willingness to compromise, that's fascinating, but I want to know more specifically what compromise means. What does it mean to compromise? And on a broader level, what I'd be fascinated to hear is how your project throws light on the bigger question about partition, because there has been functional partition now for more than 40 years in Cyprus. Partition as an appropriate solution to ethnic conflict. There's a political scientist or an IR scholar named Chaim Kaufman who wrote an article, a very famous article about 25 years ago, on partition as a solution to civil wars, and he's all in favor of it. And I ran a conference some years ago in Oxford about partition, and we had people talk about Cyprus and talk about Northern Ireland and India, Pakistan, and Israel, Palestine. And the general assumption was that partition is a very bad thing, except the speaker who was talking about Cyprus who said, well, it's actually worked really well. So I thought that was quite fascinating because everybody else was cross about partition. And then the possible parallels between your own story and an even more intractable conflict, which is Israel-Palestine. The notion of a right, you talk about your interviewees on the right as claiming a right. The right to claim unification. It reminded me so much of the Palestinian right of return. The 4 million Palestinian refugees who are registered as refugees with the United Nations, I don't know how many of them actually would intend to claim that right or to implement that right, but they insist on the right and that no one can abrogate what is considered to be an inalienable right. So I think this is part of a broader picture about how people construct a kind of an emotional universe for themselves in which no one will take away their right, even if they will not implement it. Similarly, when you discuss civic nationalism, which can be strongly ethnic, this also sounds to me like Israel-Palestine, but now the parallel would not be to the Palestinians, but to the Israeli left, which can use a language of civic nationalism, but actually can be quite ethnic or even ethnocentric. So anyway, all 4 of these papers, as you can see, have global implications. And I'm just very impressed by all 4 and very glad to have had the opportunity to read and to hear your work. I look forward to your comments and to all of your questions as well.
Thank you, Professor Penslar. I'd like to give the opportunity to the presenters to see if they'd like to respond or ask any questions, and then we'll open up to a general Q&A where we can open up these wonderful topics to wider, broader discussion. Or any?
I would love to respond. First of all, thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate your thoughts. The one that really stuck out to me the most was the relationship to the tax farming reforms, which is very interesting. I'm also looking at the etymology of this term concession, which in Ottoman Turkish is imtiyaz, which means, it means concession, but it can also mean privilege. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of this split between the agency being attributed to the receiver, the recipient, or to the gifter, which is the government. And what's most interesting about the term imtiyaz is that it was also used for tax farming purposes. So people who held a particular region and were responsible for collecting the taxes on that region were termed imtiyazlı, which means holding an imtiyaz. And more strikingly to me, actually, certain regions were considered imtiyazlı. So actually Serbia itself, as a autonomous but not independent polity, was also imtiyazlı. So
same thing in Polish, by the way.
Really?
Arenda and arandar, and vast portions of Poland, Lithuania were arenda territories. So it was also, anyway, sorry, it's very exciting stuff. Sorry.
That's interesting. What strikes me though is this relationship between transportation technology, farming, and also political understandings of space. And I think it's interesting that all of those levels are connected by one term.
So you mentioned the question of partition, which is actually one of the things that drew me to Cyprus in the first place. If we accept Gellnerian nationalism and the idea as being the idea that the ethnic or the national and political unit should be the same, and ethnic formations as the foundation for a national unit, then the status quo, which is a partition between ethnically more or less homogeneous states, should be an ideal solution. And yet, there is an agitation for reunification, at least publicly, which could be interpreted as a power struggle or as something more. And so I don't know that there's really an answer.
I'll find out when I read the piece.
Yeah. And this idea of compromise that you brought up, there are several things where sort of that's the question in your comments. Compromise seems to mean something different to every individual who I talk to.
Right.
There was this general idea that they should get things too, or that things should be equal in terms of actually the Israel-Palestine conflict. The right of return model is something that kept coming up. And people would say, of course, Turkish Cypriots also lost things, and so they should also have a right of return to the South. But there's a question about property value and who's actually getting what, even if you structure this system as theoretically equal, which to me always seems to be interpreted as having Greek Cypriots gain more, despite the theoretical equality and concession.
So what I was most interested in your comments was sort of the discussion you brought up about the novel and sort of its purpose in British society. And I think what first drew me to my thesis topic was I was puzzled because in the suffrage movement, there are only probably about 4 novels published about women's suffrage, but there are dozens and dozens of plays. And since the novel had sort of traditionally been a woman's form of writing, I was really struck by this anomaly. And so that's what drew me to my topic. And I agree with you about the performativity of plays being sort of important. It does really tie in quite nicely to the performativity of the movement, and especially of the suffragettes. That's what I wrote my junior paper on, actually. But then the thing that's most interesting, at least in my first chapter of this thesis, is Elizabeth Robbins, and her play and her novel are an identical story. So Votes for Women is the name of her play, and then she publishes that, or it's staged rather, in 1907, and she immediately starts working on the novel, which is called The Convert. It's the same story, but she adds a backstory. So the first sort of 300 pages of the novel are new, and the last 50 pages are the play verbatim. And that's really interesting because they read very differently. So the play really has this focus on the main character. It's revealed to the audience is a suffragette who supports the cause and has always supported the cause. But in The Convert, they add this sort of very elaborate backstory. So you figure out she actually starts as an anti-suffragist, and you see her sort of gradually converted to the cause. And even the titles, The Convert obviously speaks to this process, and Votes for Women is probably the most common slogan that was used in the movement. And it actually becomes the name of the suffragette newspaper in the same year, which is really quite interesting. So I think that sort of speaks, the novel was something that people could take their time with and could sort of explore these arguments at great length, whereas the play really was like greatest hits of the argument of the movement.
But the play also offers an intense emotional experience.
Yes.
When I'm talking about this journalist, the play is filled with these kind of, declamations, and it ends, of course, tragic people getting run through with swords and dying on stage and all of that. And there's this kind of cathartic effect. It's meant to really shock you, whereas the novel is almost the opposite. So it's fascinating.
Thank you very much. I think the question about how the term is applied, whether it's just to South Asian women, whether is kind of still an open question for me. In the house itself, there are Chinese ayahs, so it's certainly applied more widely than just to South Asian women, but the word, I think, derives from Portuguese and Hindi, which maybe implies that it has this kind of origin in Portuguese colonialism. And
But
there's
is
this
the
kind
word
of,
itself from Portuguese, from Hindi, or is it some sort of Creole word? Or?
I think, to be honest, I don't know that much about the derivation, other than the fact that it seems to have been traced through these two kind of linguistic traditions. I don't know if it's some sort of hybrid. I'm not sure. This kind of like Portuguese question has come up a couple of times for me because there are a couple of instances when Catholic ayahs are described as particularly valuable, or ayahs with names that sound like they're probably Portuguese origins, Catholic origins.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Well, I'll open it up to a general discussion. Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself also at the same time?
Hi, my name is Andrew. I'm a fellow CES grant recipient. I just wanted to say I'm really impressed by all the primary research you guys did. I was hoping to ask questions of Caleb and Emma. Caleb, I thought your work in the Art and Archives is incredible. I was wondering, picking up on the point about discourses of modernity, if you find that railroads also relate to this idea of highly regimented Western notions of time. And I was thinking in particular of Ahmed Hamdi Tanpınar's novel, The Time Regulation Institute, where one of the protagonists describes this defining moment in his life is receiving a watch. And this idea that railroads operate, obviously, or ideally, operate on very regimented schedules. And I was wondering if you found that in your primary research, this notion of time plays a crucial role in sort of Ottoman conceptions of modernity. And secondly, I was wondering how your thesis relates to contemporary Turkish representations of Ottoman encounters with modernity. So for my Turkish class, I just watched Cem Yılmaz's film Yaşı Batı, which you may have seen. But basically it's about these two Ottomans who go to the West, and their encounter is just spectacularly comical. They have like outdated weaponry, they can't figure out how anything works. And it's interesting because by your account, this would sort of play into the idea that the Ottomans were clueless and couldn't possibly adapt to these conceptions of modernity that your thesis would suggest they actually did adapt to. So I was wondering if you sort of see your thesis as interacting with contemporary Turkish representation.
Sure.
And then Emma, Emma, I was also interested in regarding your thesis about where these terms or this dichotomy between suffragists and suffragettes come from. Is it like imposed by later historians? Does it emerge from the vocabulary of the texts that you're reading?
Okay, so thank you so much for those questions, and I'm glad that you hit on them because those are coming up more in my second and third chapters, more than my first one. The importance of time, obviously critical to literature from this time period on railroads, and it doesn't come up as much in the government documents from this time period, but it comes up a great deal in the travelogues that are the focus of my second chapter. And one thing that is quite interesting in the Ottoman case is that there was actually a separate system of time that was unique to the Ottoman Empire. And so in these travelogues, whenever they list a time, they list time alla turca and time alla franja. And alla franja time was railroad time, effectively, which in the 1880s was sort of standardized across Europe. So it's a very interesting history. I'm still kind of getting into it, but I can tell you that just before World War I, the Ottoman Empire actually had a sort of time reform and adopted alla franja time. So there's a real politics that's involved in this time making, which I think you hit on in later literature as well. To the current representations of encounters, for those who don't know, Turkish television in particular is a very rich field for historical analysis, and I think that there's not enough work being done there. There are a number of sort of Ottoman shows, sort of like Game of Thrones, but with Ottoman characters. And I think that in shows that depict the 19th century, there's a strong sense that disaster is around the corner. And I think that you get this even going back earlier, the sense of Ottoman incompetence and perhaps Ottoman desire to change and to succeed, but the sense that there is a necessary tragic ending, which actually gets at the play model, right? And a television show is similar. And I think that the focalization of these literatures on World War I and the ultimate defeat of the Ottoman Empire is projected back into earlier depictions, and that's why there's that sense of incompetence earlier. And I think that I see my historical work as a way to sort of undermine that current model.
So just to ask a follow-up.
Sure.
The reform of time is pre-Kemalist?
Yes. Yes.
So regarding the suffragist and suffragette, suffragist was the term that had been used since the 1870s to describe people who supported women's suffrage. Suffragette is actually a term that was invented by one of the national newspapers in 1905, I believe, and was, I suspect, a sort of attempt to be condescending to these women. It was sort of mocking a protest they had held. Sort of to their surprise, the suffragettes decided they liked the term and sort of self-proclaimed themselves suffragettes, and it stuck. And I think both groups were interested in having sort of different terms because the suffragists really wanted to make it clear they were not militant, they were not breaking the law, and the suffragettes really did want to sort of embrace this sort of radical aspect of their identity. So ever since then, those have been the terms we've used.
Hello, thank you all for the interesting presentations. I missed the first half, sorry. I just caught Andy's presentation and I know a bit about your work too. So I have a question for Andy then. You mentioned the identity, how in flux it is. And I was wondering how external events shaped it, or did you even have a chance to talk to them how different events like the partition plus the EU membership accession talk and the Eurozone crisis and what happened in Greece, do all these external events in a way translate in their head, and do they even change their feelings about what do they feel about Cyprus as a whole island or their identity towards Greece? And another thing that I was very curious to know more about is that you talk about left and right, and I was wondering what do they mean in the Cypriot context, left and right? How right are they right, and how left is the left? And
Yeah, so external events have definitely shaped people's impressions of sort of where they belong. The Eurozone crisis and the subsequent haircut in Cyprus, where all assets over $1 million were seized and used to pay down the national debt, or by Cypriot bank account holders, definitely impacted people's views of the EU. I spent a lot of time talking about the perception of the relationship between Cyprus and the EU and Cyprus and Greece. People generally tended to hold positive views of the EU, and that seemed to be based on the idea that as EU citizens, we have access to all of Europe, and the advantages outweigh the negative aspects, especially given that pretty much everyone I talked to was not personally affected by the haircut or the Eurozone crisis to the extent that others were, although they did argue that it was unfair to them. In terms of the relationship with Greece, most people did articulate some version of Greece is the mother country. Greece is, I'm Greek. One person very sort of clearly articulated it in a way that I liked, saying, I am Greek in my religion, my tongue, and my ethnicity, but I'm Cypriot because this is where my home is and this is where my family is. Which makes sense to some extent, but also doesn't quite get at the divide, which, I mean, again, I'm not sure that the divide is as clear as the existing literature is suggesting. In terms of the left and the right, I wasn't really clear on how far to the right is and how far to the left is. DC is the governing party right now. At least at the high levels of government, they engaged in a series of talks with the TRNC for reunification earlier this year, actually this summer while I was conducting my interviews, which would seem to suggest that they are not operating on a strictly enosis-based platform. And at the end of the day, they are a Cypriot political party. They are union with Greece would significantly deteriorate their own power. The left, similarly, given that the main left party is a communist party, should be an internationalist party in terms of theory, but is operating more increasingly as a national political party. And because of the specific situation with Cyprus, again, people on the left are more likely to talk in national terms to some extent than people on the right. Obviously, it comes down to voters and the behavior of the parties at the level of actually governing doesn't necessarily correlate with what voters want. So the election is this year, and we'll see what happens. But I got the sense that generally things had moved to a fairly stable center-left equilibrium.
Well, I imagine there are many more questions. We've reached the point where coffee and cookies will be served upstairs, and the coffee part is particularly tempting me right now. But I want to thank everyone here. I would like everyone to join in thanking our presenters and our commentator for a wonderful panel today. And there's coffee and cookies upstairs, as I mentioned.